I am Bronson Harris, 67 years old, and just 3 months ago, I lost Margaret, my wife of 42 years, to cancer. After the funeral, my son Edward insisted I move in with his family. I was grieving but grateful, hoping for comfort among loved ones. I never expected what happened at dinner last night. My daughter-in-law Lisa stood up, eyes cold as ice, and shouted, "Now that your wife is dead, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back." What hurt most was seeing my son silently nod in agreement. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you are watching from, and subscribe if family betrayal has ever cut you deep. Margaret and I met at the Minnesota State Fair back in the summer of '78. I was 20 years old, working at my uncle's corn dog stand, when this beautiful woman with chestnut hair and the most infectious laugh ordered 6 corn dogs for her family. She returned alone an hour later, claiming she needed another one because it was so good. I knew it was just an excuse to talk to me. That simple corn dog started 42 years of love, partnership, and building a life together. We married 11 months later in a small ceremony at her parents' backyard. Neither of us had much money, but we had dreams bigger than our bank accounts. Our first home was a tiny 1-bedroom apartment in St. Paul, where the heating worked only half the time, and the neighbors argued loudly every weekend. But it was ours, and we were happy. 3 years into our marriage, we welcomed Edward, our only child. Margaret was the most natural mother I had ever seen, patient and loving even through sleepless nights and colicky evenings. I worked 2 jobs those early years, so she could stay home with our boy until he started school. Those were lean times, eating a lot of macaroni and cheese, but they were good times too. When Edward was 7, we finally saved enough for a down payment on a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Minneapolis. Nothing fancy, just 1,500 square feet with a small yard. But to us, it was a palace. Margaret planted rose bushes along the front walkway and painted each room herself. That house became our forever home, where we made holiday memories, celebrated birthdays, and eventually sent our son off to college. For 35 years we lived in that house. We replaced the roof twice, updated the kitchen once, and watched the neighborhood children grow up, move away, and sometimes return with families of their own. Our mortgage was finally paid off just 5 years ago, and we had planned to enjoy our retirement there, maybe travel a bit, spend time with grandchildren. Then came the diagnosis. Margaret had been having stomach pains for weeks but dismissed them as nothing serious. When she finally went to the doctor, the news devastated us. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months at best. My strong, vibrant wife suddenly faced an enemy we could not fight. The next 3 years were a roller coaster of treatments, remissions, and recurrences. Margaret defied those initial 6 months and fought like hell. She endured chemotherapy that made her beautiful hair fall out. She sat through radiation treatments that burned her skin. She tried experimental protocols that made her violently ill but gave us hope. Through it all, she never complained, not once. The medical bills piled up quickly. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket costs were astronomical. Our savings disappeared within the first year. Then went our retirement funds, cashed out early despite the penalties. By the beginning of year 3, we faced the hardest decision of our lives. We had to sell our beloved home to pay for a promising new treatment not covered by insurance. Edward and his wife Lisa helped us move into a small apartment. I could tell Margaret was heartbroken to leave our home, but she never said it. Instead, she focused on arranging our remaining furniture to make the apartment cozy, putting up her favorite family photos, and telling me it felt more manageable anyway. The new treatment worked for a while. We got 6 more precious months together. But eventually, Margaret's body could fight no more. She passed peacefully in her sleep one Tuesday morning in April. I had been holding her hand all night, somehow knowing the end was near. When I woke and felt her hand had gone cold, a part of me died too. The funeral was beautiful but painful. So many friends and family came to celebrate her life. Edward handled most of the arrangements, for which I was grateful. I found myself unable to make even simple decisions in those first days without her. Lisa organized the reception afterward at their home, and everyone commented on how lovely everything was. It was at that reception when Edward and Lisa first suggested I should move in with them. Their house was large, with a finished basement they rarely used. They had converted it into a guest suite years ago, with its own small bathroom. "Dad, you shouldn't be alone right now," Edward said, his arm around my shoulders. "We want you to come stay with us, for as long as you need." Lisa nodded in agreement. The kids would love having Grandpa around more. And honestly, we could use the help with them too. Their children, my grandchildren, Tyler and Amanda, were 12 and 9 at the time. Good kids, always excited to see their grandfather. The thought of being around family instead of returning to an empty apartment gave me hope. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt a small spark of optimism. "Are you sure I won't be in the way?" I asked. "Of course not," Lisa assured me. "You're family, and family sticks together." I moved in the following weekend. Edward and his friend James helped transport my remaining belongings. I had sold or donated most of our furniture when we downsized to the apartment, so all I brought were clothes, books, and personal items. The most precious of these were the mementos of Margaret, our wedding album, the quilt her grandmother had made for us, a box of love letters we had exchanged when I traveled for work. That first week was good. The grandkids were excited, showing me their school projects and wanting me to watch their favorite shows with them. I made breakfast for everyone each morning, wanting to contribute to the household. Lisa seemed appreciative, complimenting my pancakes and thanking me for tidying the kitchen afterward. Looking back, there were warning signs even then. The way Lisa rearranged the dishes I had washed, the slightly tight smile when I suggested cooking dinner one night, the whispered conversations between her and Edward that stopped when I entered a room. But I was still deep in grief, not seeing clearly. And I wanted so badly to believe I had a place here, with the only family I had left. By the second week in their home, subtle shifts began to occur. I noticed Lisa would sigh loudly whenever I entered the living room, where she was watching television. At first, I thought perhaps she was just having a rough day, but the pattern continued. If I sat down to join her, she would suddenly remember something she needed to do elsewhere in the house. One morning, I overslept until 8:30, exhausted from a night of grief dreams about Margaret. When I came upstairs, Lisa was in the kitchen, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Good morning," I said, reaching for the coffee pot. "Some of us have been up for hours," she replied. "Tyler needed help with his science project, but I handled it. I assumed you wanted to sleep in." Her tone made it clear this was not acceptable. From then on, I set my alarm for 6, making sure I was upstairs before anyone else needed anything. Edward began coming home later from work. When he had first suggested I move in, he had talked about evening chess games and watching baseball together. But now he would arrive after dinner, claiming meetings ran long or traffic was bad. On weekends, he suddenly had projects that kept him in the garage or errands that took him away from the house. When we did speak, our conversations felt strained. If I mentioned a memory of Margaret or expressed my grief, he would pat my shoulder awkwardly and find a reason to leave the room. It was as if my sadness made him uncomfortable, or perhaps reminded him too much of his own loss. Either way, the son who had been so supportive at the funeral seemed to be retreating from me more each day. The grandchildren were still a bright spot, especially in those early weeks. Tyler would ask me to help with his math homework, and Amanda loved hearing stories about when her father was a boy. But even this began to change. One afternoon, Amanda asked if I would take her to the park, like we used to when she visited our old house. Before I could answer, Lisa interjected. "Grandpa's too tired for the park, honey. Why not play in the backyard instead? And remember, Grandpa needs his quiet time." I had never told Amanda I was too tired, nor had I ever requested quiet time, but the message was clear. Lisa was creating distance between me and the children. About 3 weeks after I moved in, I overheard Lisa on the phone with one of her friends. I had gone upstairs to get a book from my room and paused in the hallway when I heard my name. "Bronson is still here, yes," she was saying, her voice low but irritated. "Edward says we need to give him time, but honestly, Caroline, I did not sign up to have an elderly father-in-law living with us indefinitely. He shuffles around the house sighing all day. It is so depressing." Her words stung like a physical slap. I retreated to my room, embarrassed and hurt. Was I really such a burden? I resolved to be even less intrusive. I began eating breakfast before everyone woke and often skipped dinner, claiming I wasn't hungry. I spent more time in my basement room, coming up only when invited or to use the kitchen when no one was around. I tried to speak with Edward about the tension one evening when he arrived home earlier than usual. Lisa had taken the children to their sports practices, so we had a rare moment alone. "Son, I get the feeling Lisa is finding it difficult having me here," I began carefully. Edward's face immediately closed off. "Dad, Lisa has been nothing but accommodating. She is under a lot of pressure with her job and the kids. If anything, she was hoping you would help more around here." "Help more?" I was genuinely confused. "I clean up after myself, make my bed, even prepared meals a few times until Lisa said she preferred to handle the cooking." "Look," Edward sighed, "this adjustment period is hard for everyone. Mom's gone, and we are all grieving in our own ways. Just try not to add to Lisa's stress, okay?" He walked away before I could respond, leaving me feeling like I had somehow failed a test I didn't know I was taking. As weeks turned into a month, my space in the house seemed to shrink. Items I had placed on the mantel, including a beloved photo of Margaret, mysteriously migrated to my bedroom. When I asked about it, Lisa said the space needed to be decluttered for an upcoming dinner party. The dinner party came and went, but my things were never welcomed back to the common areas. The message became increasingly clear. I could stay physically in their home, but evidence of my existence should be confined to my basement room. One rainy Tuesday, about 5 weeks after moving in, I returned from a doctor's appointment to find Lisa had organized my closet without asking. Several of Margaret's sweaters that I had kept were now gone. "Where are Margaret's cardigans?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, those old things," Lisa replied without looking up from her laptop. "They were taking up space, and you never wear them. I put them in the donation pile for the church rummage sale. They were not meant to be worn," I said, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. They still smelled like her. For a brief moment, something like shame flickered across Lisa's face, but it quickly hardened again. "Bronson, holding on to things like that isn't healthy. You need to move on. Margaret would want that." The presumption that she knew what Margaret would want infuriated me, but I swallowed my anger. This was their house, after all. I had nowhere else to go. The final blow of this initial period came when I discovered a small family heirloom missing from my room. It was a pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather, which I had planned to give to Tyler on his next birthday. When I asked Lisa about it, her response chilled me. That old thing was just collecting dust, and it didn't even work properly. I put it away for safekeeping. Besides, Tyler is more into digital watches these days. It wasn't her decision to make, but I was learning that in Lisa's house, everything was her decision. My disappointment was evolving into something deeper and more painful. I wasn't just grieving Margaret anymore. I was grieving the relationship with my son I thought we had, and the welcoming family environment that had been promised but never truly existed. By the second month of living under Edward and Lisa's roof, any pretense of welcome had evaporated entirely. Lisa's behavior shifted from passive-aggressive to openly hostile. No longer did she bother with the polite veneer when others were present. Her criticisms became daily occurrences, often delivered in front of the children. "Bronson, could you please not leave water spots on the kitchen faucet? I just had this fixture installed last year." "Bronson, that chair you keep sitting in is actually part of a designer set. It is not meant for everyday use." "Bronson, we do not wear outdoor shoes in this house. That is the third time I have had to remind you this week." Each comment came with an exasperated tone, suggesting I was deliberately trying to upset her. In truth, I was walking on eggshells, trying my best to follow the unwritten rules that seemed to multiply daily. What hurt most was Edward's response to these interactions. My son, who once would have defended me, now sided with Lisa in every disagreement. If I tried to explain myself, Edward would cut me off. "Dad, just do what Lisa asks, okay? This is her house too, and she likes things a certain way." The phrase "her house too" struck me every time. Never once did either of them acknowledge that I might have any right to comfort or space in what was supposedly now my home as well. One Saturday morning, I came upstairs to find Lisa rearranging my few belongings in the basement room. She had moved the small desk where I wrote letters and did crossword puzzles, placing it in a dark corner. My reading chair now faced the blank wall rather than the small window that provided my only natural light. "What are you doing?" I asked, genuinely confused. "This arrangement makes more sense," she said without looking up. "The room feels more open this way, and we need to move some storage boxes down here. But I cannot see to read in that corner," I protested mildly. Lisa straightened up, hands on her hips. "You know, Bronson, most people would be grateful to have a free place to stay rather than complaining about the furniture arrangement." The word "free" hit like a slap. Yes, I was not paying rent, but I had given Edward and Lisa $20,000 from the sale of my house to help with expenses. That money, which could have secured me a small apartment for at least a year, had disappeared into their bank account. Whenever I gently asked how I might contribute to household expenses instead, Lisa would say they would figure it all out later. My relationship with my grandchildren was suffering too. Tyler and Amanda were no longer allowed to come to my room to visit. Lisa implemented a new rule that they needed to finish all homework and chores before any grandpa time. But somehow, the list of chores expanded to fill all available hours before bedtime. If I tried to engage with them in common areas of the house, Lisa would suddenly remember appointments, enrichment activities, or playdates that required the children to leave immediately. On the rare occasions I was included in family movie nights or game time, Lisa would make pointed comments to the children. "Remember, kids, Grandpa gets tired easily, so we cannot play too long. Grandpa probably will not understand this movie. It might be too complicated for him." I was 67, not senile, but Lisa's constant implications of mental decline were starting to make the children view me differently. I caught Tyler explaining a simple board game rule to me with exaggerated slowness, mimicking his mother's condescending tone. Family dinners became an exercise in humiliation. Lisa would serve everyone normally, but make a show of cutting my meat into tiny pieces, as if I were a toddler, or give me a smaller portion with a comment about watching your cholesterol. If I tried to contribute to the conversation, she would talk over me, or immediately change the subject. One evening, I mentioned a news story I had read about local politics. Before I could finish my thought, Lisa interrupted. "Edward, did you tell your father about the retirement communities we looked at last weekend? There is a nice one just 20 minutes from here with activities for seniors. They even have a shuttle service to doctor appointments." I looked at my son in shock. "You are looking at retirement homes for me? Without even discussing it?" Edward had the grace to look embarrassed, but quickly recovered. "It was just preliminary research, Dad, for down the road." "Way down the road," Lisa added with a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. "Unless, of course, you are feeling ready sooner." The message could not have been clearer. They were actively planning to move me out, surveying options without my input or consent. I was a problem to be solved, not a family member to be integrated into their lives. That night, I lay awake remembering how Edward was as a child. He had been such a kind boy, always defending smaller kids on the playground, bringing home stray animals that needed care. Margaret and I had raised him to value family above all else. What had happened to that boy? Had I simply not seen the man he was becoming, or had something fundamental changed? Sleep became increasingly difficult. I would lie awake until 2 or 3 in the morning, replaying conversations, wondering what I could do differently. When I did sleep, Nightmares about homelessness or being abandoned in nursing homes jolted me awake, heart racing. My appetite diminished until my clothes began hanging loosely on my frame. During this time, my grief for Margaret took on new dimensions. Beyond missing her presence, her love, her companionship, I now grieved for her advocacy. Margaret would never have allowed this situation to develop. She had been my buffer, my partner in navigating family dynamics. Without her, I felt exposed and vulnerable in ways I had never experienced. The situation reached a painful crescendo when I discovered one of my most treasured mementos of Margaret had been damaged. She had painted a small watercolor of our first house as an anniversary gift years ago. I kept it on the modest nightstand in my basement room. One afternoon, I returned from a walk to find it missing. After searching frantically, I discovered it in the trash, the frame broken and the painting water damaged. When confronted, Lisa claimed she had accidentally knocked it over while vacuuming. "It was just a little painting," she said dismissively. "You cannot keep every single thing that reminds you of her." But the placement in the trash, rather than any attempt to salvage it, told me this was no accident. It was a message about my place in this home and the value of my memories. I retreated further into myself after that incident. I began spending hours at the local library just to be out of the house. I found a small coffee shop where the staff came to know me, allowing me to sit with a single cup for hours. I volunteered at a community garden, more for somewhere to go than out of interest in horticulture. My world was shrinking, my confidence diminishing with each day under their roof. The vibrant, capable man I had been throughout my career as a high school history teacher was fading, replaced by someone who second-guessed every word, every movement, every decision. I felt myself becoming the doddering old man Lisa portrayed me as, and still I stayed, because the alternatives seemed worse. My savings were nearly depleted. Social Security covered basic needs but not housing in our expensive area. Friends had offered couches temporarily, but I could not imagine imposing long-term. The retirement communities Lisa mentioned were far beyond my financial reach. I felt trapped in a situation that was slowly crushing my spirit. What I did not know then was that the worst was yet to come. All the small cruelties were merely preludes to the moment when they would finally say aloud what their actions had been telling me for months. The evening began like any other Tuesday dinner at Edward and Lisa's house. I had spent most of the day at the library, returning just before 6 as expected. Lisa had prepared pot roast, a meal I once would have enjoyed but now barely tasted as I ate mechanically, trying to finish quickly to minimize my presence at the table. The children were unusually quiet. Tyler, now 13, kept his eyes on his plate, while 9-year-old Amanda darted nervous glances between her parents. There was a tension in the air I could not identify but definitely felt. Lisa served dessert, a store-bought apple pie that she placed in front of everyone except me. "None for you, Bronson," she said with that familiar tight smile. "Sugar is not good for someone your age." I nodded, used to these small humiliations by now. But then Lisa remained standing, wine glass in hand, looking at Edward expectantly. He cleared his throat but said nothing. "Well, if you will not say it, I will," Lisa finally declared, her voice taking on an edge I had never heard before. She turned to face me directly. "Bronson, we need to discuss your living situation." My stomach knotted instantly. Edward still would not meet my eyes, studying the pattern on his plate as if it contained ancient secrets. "What about my living situation?" I asked quietly. Lisa took a long sip of wine, then set the glass down with deliberate precision. When she spoke again, her voice was cold and determined. "It is not working out. It has been 3 months since Margaret died, and frankly, we expected you to have moved on by now." "Moved on?" I repeated, genuinely confused by what she meant. "From your grief," she clarified, waving her hand dismissively. "All the sighing and moping around. The children find it depressing. We find it depressing." Edward finally looked up. "What Lisa means, Dad, is that maybe it is time to consider other options." "Other options?" I echoed, still not fully comprehending what was happening. That is when Lisa's composure finally shattered. Her face flushed red, and she slammed her palm on the table, making the silverware jump. "Now that your wife is dead, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back," she shouted, her voice rising to a volume that made Amanda flinch. "We have put up with you for months out of obligation. But this was never meant to be permanent." The room fell silent. The children sat frozen, eyes wide. I looked to my son, waiting for him to defend me, to object to his wife's cruelty. Instead, Edward just smiled tightly and nodded in agreement. "The house was never really yours anyway, Dad," he added, his voice soft but firm. "We only invited you to stay temporarily, until you figured things out." The betrayal in those words cut deeper than any physical pain I had ever experienced. Not just Lisa's outburst, which was shocking but somewhat expected given her escalating hostility. No, it was Edward's calm agreement, his dismissal of me as a temporary inconvenience rather than his father, that broke something fundamental inside me. "I gave you $20,000, I said quietly. "From the sale of the home your mother and I worked our entire lives to pay off." Lisa rolled her eyes dramatically. "Please, do you know what housing costs these days? $20,000 barely covers 6 months of having you here, with the extra utilities, food, and inconvenience." Inconvenience? I could barely whisper the word. "Dad," Edward interjected, using the reasonable tone I recognized from his childhood when he wanted something, "we are not saying you have to leave immediately. Take a few weeks to find a place. There are plenty of senior apartments that would be much more appropriate for someone in your situation." My situation? I looked at my son, truly seeing him for perhaps the first time. "And what situation is that exactly?" "You know," he replied, not quite meeting my eyes again. "Being elderly, alone, limited income." In that moment, I saw with perfect clarity what I had been to them these past months. Not a grieving husband, not a father or grandfather, not even a person with feelings and dignity. I was a problem to be managed, an obligation to be fulfilled until they could justify discarding me with clear consciences. "When do you want me gone?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. Lisa seemed slightly taken aback by my direct question, perhaps having anticipated more resistance or emotion. "Well, by the end of the month would be ideal," she replied. "We are planning to convert the basement back into a recreation room for the kids. 2 weeks. They were giving me 2 weeks to find somewhere to live after losing my wife, my home, and now my family." Tyler, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "But where will Grandpa go?" Lisa shot him a warning look. "That is not your concern, Tyler. Grandpa is a grown man who needs to take responsibility for himself." "But you said he could stay as long as he needed," Amanda added, her small voice trembling slightly. "That is enough," Edward said sharply. "This is adult business. Both of you, go to your rooms and finish homework." The children reluctantly left the table, Tyler pausing to give me a quick, awkward pat on the shoulder as he passed. That small gesture of kindness nearly undid me. When they were gone, I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. "I will be out before the end of the month," I said quietly. "You have my word." Lisa nodded briskly, already gathering plates as if the matter was settled to her satisfaction. Edward looked momentarily uncomfortable but said nothing more. I walked downstairs to my basement room in a daze, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed Margaret and I once shared in our real home. The bed that had been too large for the apartment, so we had sold it. The bed where we had held each other through good times and bad, raised a child, made plans, dreamed dreams. Now I sat on a narrow twin bed in a basement, completely alone. That night was perhaps the darkest of my life. Darker even than the night Margaret died, because then I had been surrounded by people who appeared to care. Now I knew the truth. I had no one. My wife was gone. My son had revealed himself to be a stranger. My home was not my home. At 67, I was essentially homeless, with limited resources and no clear path forward. I thought about my options until the early hours of the morning. I considered calling some of my former colleagues from the high school, but most had moved away or were dealing with their own aging issues. I had a small circle of friends, but none I felt close enough to ask for significant help. Margaret had been my best friend, my confidant, my partner in all things. Without her, my support system had collapsed. For a brief, dark moment, I even considered whether life was worth continuing. The thought of starting over at my age, alone and nearly broke, seemed overwhelming. But as dawn broke, I thought of what Margaret would say if she could see me now. She would be furious at Edward and Lisa, yes, but she would also remind me of my own strength. Bronson Harris. I could almost hear her say, "You did not survive Vietnam, and 40 years of teaching teenagers to give up now." The memory of her voice, so clear in my mind, gave me the first glimmer of determination. I might be down, but I was not out. Not yet. As the first light of morning filtered through my small basement window, I made a decision. I would not beg. I would not argue. I would not give Edward and Lisa the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I would leave on my terms, with what dignity I had left. Morning arrived after a sleepless night, and with it came an unexpected sense of clarity. The shock of the previous evening had crystallized into something harder, more resolute. As I made my bed with military precision, a habit from my youth that Margaret had always teased me about, I made a decision. I would not accept the role of victim they had assigned me. My first action was to call Margaret's sister, Nancy. We had always been close, but I had withdrawn from everyone after Margaret's death, sinking into my grief. Nancy answered on the second ring. "Bronson, is that you? I have been worried sick, not hearing from you for weeks." Her warm voice brought tears to my eyes, but I blinked them away. "Nancy, I need to ask a favor, and I promise it is temporary." I explained the situation as calmly as I could, leaving out the most hurtful details. Nancy's reaction was immediate and fierce. "Those ungrateful. Edward should be ashamed of himself. Margaret would be heartbroken. You come here right now, Bronson. The guest room is already made up." Nancy lived 3 hours away, in a small town near the Wisconsin border. She was a widow herself, her husband having passed 5 years earlier. The offer was tempting, but I knew her small house was already crowded with her daughter's family who had moved in last year after a divorce. "Just for a few days," I said. "Just until I figure out next steps." With accommodation temporarily secured, I felt the first weight lift from my shoulders. Next, I pulled out my address book, a relic in this digital age, but one I was grateful for now. I flipped through until I found the entry for Harold Fleming, my former department head at Lincoln High School. Harold had retired 2 years before me and had always said to call if I needed anything. I had never taken him up on the offer until now. Harold answered, with the same booming voice I remembered. After catching up briefly, I explained my situation, this time not holding back any details. Harold listened without interrupting. "Bronson," he said when I finished, "I have always respected you as a colleague, but right now, I respect you even more for how you are handling this. Listen, I am on the board of the senior center downtown. They are looking for someone part-time to teach computer basics to seniors. The pay is not great, but it might help supplement your Social Security. Would you be interested?" I had taught history, not computers, but I was reasonably tech-savvy for my generation. "I would be very interested," I replied, feeling a small spark of hope ignite. "Good. Come see me when you get to town, and we will make it happen." With those 2 calls, I had secured temporary housing and a potential income source. It was not much, but it was a start. For the first time since Margaret's diagnosis, I felt like I was taking control of my own life, rather than being swept along by circumstances. I spent the next hour carefully packing my belongings. I was determined to be out before Edward and Lisa returned from work, avoiding any further confrontation. As I sorted through what little I had brought with me, I realized how few material possessions truly mattered. Some clothes, my books, the remaining photographs and mementos of Margaret that had survived Lisa's purging. Everything fit into 2 suitcases and a small box. Before leaving, I wrote a brief note to my grandchildren, telling them I loved them and providing Nancy's phone number. I considered writing something to Edward but decided against it. What could I say that would make any difference now? I called a taxi service, not wanting to ask any more favors from neighbors who had already witnessed enough of my family's drama. As I waited for the car to arrive, I took one last look around the basement room that had been my prison for 3 months. I felt no attachment to it, only relief to be leaving. The taxi driver was a chatty man in his 40s who asked where I was headed. "Bus station," I replied. "I am starting over." He glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Starting over? At your age? Is there a better time?" I countered. He laughed at that. "Guess not. Good for you, man." That small vote of confidence from a stranger somehow meant more than I expected. By the time I boarded the bus to Nancy's town, I felt a strange mixture of grief and liberation. I was leaving behind the last connections to my old life, but also the pain and humiliation of the past 3 months. Nancy was waiting at the bus station when I arrived, her face a mixture of concern and determination. She hugged me fiercely, reminding me so much of Margaret that my throat tightened. "Those ungrateful children," she muttered as she helped me with my bags. "After everything you and Margaret did for Edward." "Please, Nancy," I said gently. "I do not want to talk about them right now." She nodded, respecting my request. "Well, I have made up the guest room and defrosted some of my beef stew. You remember how Margaret always said my stew was the only thing I could cook better than her?" That night, sitting at Nancy's kitchen table, eating familiar food, and being treated with simple kindness, I felt the first real stirrings of healing. The pain was still there, a constant companion, but now it sat alongside something new, possibility. I slept deeply for the first time in months. No nightmares, no waking in panic, just exhausted, dreamless sleep in a room where no one resented my presence. The next morning, I called Harold and arranged to meet him at the senior center. The building was bright and welcoming, nothing like the institutional facilities Lisa had been researching. Harold introduced me to the director, an energetic woman named Judith, who immediately sat me down for an informal interview. "Harold speaks very highly of you," she said. "We need someone patient to teach basic internet skills, email, social media, nothing advanced. Most of our members just want to be able to see photos of their grandchildren or send an email without asking for help. Could you do that?" "I believe I could," I replied. "I used computers throughout my teaching career and kept up with technology after retirement." "Excellent. When can you start?" Just like that, I had a job. The pay was modest, just $15 an hour for 12 hours a week, but combined with my Social Security, it would be enough to survive on. Harold helped me find a small apartment within walking distance of the senior center. It was in an older building, just one bedroom with a tiny kitchen, but the rent was manageable, and the landlord, after hearing my situation, agreed to a month-to-month lease with no deposit. "My mother went through something similar with my sister," he explained. "Family can be the cruelest sometimes." Moving in was a quick process, with so few possessions. Nancy helped me find some basic furniture at thrift stores, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a comfortable used recliner, a desk for my computer. The place was sparse, but functional. Most importantly, it was mine. No one could tell me to leave or rearrange my things or make me feel unwelcome. That first night alone in my new apartment was strange, but not as lonely as I had feared. I unpacked the box containing Margaret's things, placing her photo on the bedside table where I could see it first thing each morning. I arranged my books on a small shelf, hung up my clothes, and put away the few kitchen items I had purchased. Sitting in my recliner, looking around at my new home, I felt a curious sense of pride. 24 hours earlier, I had been at my lowest point, feeling worthless and unwanted. Now I had shelter, purpose, and the beginnings of independence. It was not the retirement Margaret and I had planned, but it was something I had created for myself. I started work at the senior center the following Monday. My first class had 5 students, all older than me, all nervous about technology but eager to learn. Their gratitude for my patience and clear explanations was a balm to my wounded self-esteem. Here, I was valued for my knowledge and kindness, not seen as a burden. Over the next few weeks, I established a routine. Mornings at the senior center teaching or helping with administrative tasks. Afternoons exploring my new town or reading in the public library. Evenings in my apartment, cooking simple meals, and gradually learning to exist as a single person after 42 years as half of a couple. The pain of Edward and Lisa's betrayal remained, a constant ache beneath everything else. But alongside it grew something unexpected, a sense of competence, of resilience, of rediscovering parts of myself that had been submerged in grief and then buried under constant criticism. I thought often of Margaret, wondering what she would think of this new chapter. In my darkest moments at Edward's house, I had felt I was failing her by not fitting into the family as she would have wanted. Now I realized that she would be proud of me for refusing to accept mistreatment, for finding my own path forward. 6 weeks after leaving Edward's house, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Tyler, my grandson, calling from a friend's phone during school lunch. "Grandpa?" His voice sounded small and uncertain. "Are you okay? Mom and Dad would not tell us where you went." Hearing his voice brought both pain and joy. "I am okay, Tyler. I am living in my own place now, near Great Aunt Nancy. Can I see you sometime? I miss you." Those simple words healed something broken inside me. I would like that very much. That call was the first small step toward rebuilding a relationship with my grandchildren on my own terms. It also marked the moment when I truly began to believe that perhaps the worst was behind me, and that even at 67, it was possible to begin again. 6 months passed quickly in my new life. Winter gave way to spring, and with the changing season came further transformation in my circumstances. My part-time position at the senior center had expanded to include administrative duties when Judith discovered my organizational skills. The increased hours meant greater financial security and less anxiety about making ends meet. My small apartment had become a true home. I had gradually acquired a few more furnishings, plants that brightened the windowsills, and art for the walls. Nothing expensive or extravagant, but items chosen with care that reflected my tastes rather than someone else's expectations. The most significant changes, however, were internal. The constant knot of tension I had carried in my chest while living with Edward and Lisa had finally released. I no longer flinched when hearing footsteps in the hallway, no longer worried that my very existence was an imposition. In its place grew a quiet confidence, a certainty that I could handle whatever challenges arose. My relationship with my grandchildren had taken an unexpected turn for the better. After that first call from Tyler, we established a regular pattern of communication. He would call every Sunday afternoon from his friend's house, and we would talk about school, his activities, and books we were both reading. I was careful never to speak negatively about his parents, regardless of my personal feelings. 2 months into this arrangement, Tyler asked if he could visit during spring break. I was hesitant, not wanting to create conflict with Edward and Lisa, but Tyler insisted they had reluctantly agreed after he made a huge deal about it. That visit was a turning point. Tyler spent 3 days with me, and we filled the time with simple activities. We visited the local museum, went fishing at a nearby lake, and cooked meals together in my small kitchen. On the second evening, as we played chess at my kitchen table, he finally asked the question I had been dreading. "Why did you leave without saying goodbye, Grandpa?" I chose my words carefully. Sometimes adults have disagreements about living arrangements. Your parents and I had different expectations, and it seemed best for everyone if I found my own place. Tyler's face suggested he knew there was more to the story. "Mom says you could not handle living with other people after Grandma died, that you were too set in your ways." The mischaracterization stung, but I kept my expression neutral. Grief affects people differently, Tyler. I was certainly sad after losing Grandma, but that was not why I left. "I heard them that night," he admitted quietly. "When Mom told you to leave, it was not fair how they treated you." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Life is not always fair, but what matters is how we respond to unfairness. I chose to build something new, rather than fight, to stay where I was not welcome. And look, I gestured around my apartment. I am doing okay. Tyler seemed satisfied with that answer, and we moved on to other topics. When it was time for him to return home, he hugged me tightly and promised to visit again in the summer. I watched him board the bus with mixed emotions, grateful for the reconnection, but aware of the delicate balance required to maintain it. A week after Tyler's visit, I received an unexpected call from Amanda. She was at a friend's birthday party and had borrowed a phone to call me secretly. Her conversation was briefer than Tyler's, constrained by time and fear of discovery, but her final words stayed with me. "I miss you, Grandpa. It is not the same without you." These connections with my grandchildren were healing, but they also highlighted the complete silence from Edward. In 6 months, my son had not called, texted, or emailed once. The few times Tyler mentioned him, it was clear Edward was uncomfortable with the renewed contact between me and the children, but was allowing it to avoid their disappointment. Lisa, however, was not content to maintain polite distance. 3 months after I left, she began a campaign to limit my access to the grandchildren. Tyler reported that his phone privileges had been restricted after she discovered our regular calls. Amanda was no longer allowed to visit friends whose parents might permit contact with me. The final straw came when Tyler informed me that Lisa had been telling extended family and friends that I had abandoned them, claiming I had mental health issues triggered by Margaret's death that made me unstable and unreliable. Rather than reacting with anger, I joined a grief support group at the senior center. It was not because I believed Lisa's accusations, but because I recognized that my grief for Margaret had been complicated by the family situation. I had never properly processed her loss amid the chaos that followed. The group met weekly and was led by a compassionate counselor named Diane. For the first time, I spoke openly about both losses, the death of my wife and the effective loss of my son. The other members, all experiencing their own grief journeys, listened without judgment and offered insights from their experiences. Grief is not linear, Diane often reminded us, and it is rarely about just one loss. When we lose someone central to our lives, we often lose parts of our identity too. Through these sessions, I began to understand that my identity had been deeply entwined with being Margaret's husband and Edward's father. Without those roles, I had felt unmoored, vulnerable to the criticism and rejection I experienced in Edward's home. Now I was learning to define myself in new ways, as a teacher, a friend, a community member, and yes, still a grandfather, even if from a distance. New friendships developed naturally in my expanded world. Harold and his wife Elaine often invited me for dinner. Judith from the senior center introduced me to her brother James, a widower who shared my interest in historical documentaries. I joined a book club at the local library and found myself engaged in stimulating discussions with people who valued my opinions. And then there was Barbara. She volunteered at the senior center, teaching watercolor painting on Thursdays. She was 65, widowed 3 years earlier, with a quick wit and kind eyes. Our friendship began with casual conversations during coffee breaks and gradually deepened when we discovered a shared love of jazz and classic films. "Would you like to see the new exhibit at the Art Museum this weekend?" she asked one day, her casual tone belied by the slight flush on her cheeks. That first outing led to others, a comfortable companionship developing between us. Barbara understood grief in a way only another widow or widower could. We spoke openly about our late spouses, sharing memories without jealousy or discomfort. There was no pressure to define our relationship, just the simple pleasure of having someone to share experiences with again. 7 months after I had left Edward's house, the confrontation I had been both expecting and dreading finally occurred. I was leaving the senior center after work when I saw Edward leaning against his car in the parking lot. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his face a mixture of defensiveness and uncertainty. "Dad," he called as I approached. "Can we talk?" I felt a surge of emotions, anger and hurt foremost among them, but I kept my expression neutral. "Of course. Would you like to come to my apartment?" It is just a few blocks from here. He nodded, following me in his car. I used the short walk to compose myself, to remember Diane's advice about expectations and boundaries. When we arrived, Edward looked around my small but neat apartment with surprise. "This is nice," he said, sounding genuinely taken aback. "Tyler said you were doing well, but I was not sure what that meant." "What did you expect?" I asked mildly. "That I would be living in squalor or a homeless shelter?" Edward had the grace to look embarrassed. "I do not know what I expected," Lisa said. "I imagine Lisa has said many things," I interrupted, my voice firm but not unkind. "Why are you here, Edward?" He sat on my couch, rubbing his hands together nervously. "The kids keep asking about you. They want you to come for Thanksgiving." Of all the reasons I had imagined for his visit, this had not been one of them. "And what do you and Lisa want?" "It is complicated," he hedged. "Lisa feels you abandoned us, left without warning." I held up a hand to stop him. "Edward, we both know that is not what happened. You were there when Lisa told me to pack my bags and leave. You agreed with her." "I did not agree exactly," he protested weakly. "I just thought maybe it was time for different arrangements. You said, and I quote, 'The house was never really yours anyway, Dad.' Those were your exact words." Edward looked down at his hands. I was under a lot of pressure. Lisa had been complaining for weeks. I took a deep breath, considering my next words carefully. "I will not pretend the past did not happen just to make everyone comfortable at Thanksgiving dinner. If you want me in your children's lives, and I very much want to be in theirs, we need to acknowledge the truth of what occurred." "What do you want me to say?" he asked, a defensive edge returning to his voice. "That we made a mistake?" "Fine, we made a mistake. Is that enough?" "It is not about saying the right words, Edward. It is about understanding why what happened was wrong and ensuring it never happens again. I will not put myself in a position to be humiliated and discarded a second time." Edward was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "I miss Mom, every day. And when you were there, in our house, it was a constant reminder that she was gone. It was easier to push you away than deal with that pain." It was the first honest thing he had said, and I felt a small crack in the wall between us. "I miss her too, every single day. But pushing away the people who share your grief does not make it better, Edward. It just means you grieve alone." We talked for another hour, not resolving everything, but making a start. I agreed to attend Thanksgiving dinner with conditions. I would come for the meal only, not stay overnight. Lisa would need to apologize directly, not through Edward. And most importantly, I would maintain my separate life, visiting on my terms, not theirs. As Edward was leaving, he paused at the door. "You seem different, Dad. More. I do not know." "Confident?" I nodded. "Losing everything will do that. You realize what you can survive." He looked troubled by that answer, as well he should. But as I closed the door behind him, I felt not triumph or vindication, but a quiet certainty that whatever happened next, I would be okay. I had rebuilt my life once. If necessary, I could do it again. 2 years have passed since that evening, when Lisa shouted those cruel words across the dinner table. 2 years of rebuilding, healing, and discovering strengths I never knew I possessed. My life today bears little resemblance to what I had imagined my retirement would be, but in many ways it has exceeded those earlier expectations. My part-time job at the senior center evolved into a full-time position as program director after Judith retired. At 69, when many of my peers have fully embraced retirement, I find myself energized by meaningful work. The salary, while modest, provides financial security I feared I had lost forever after selling our family home for Margaret's treatments. My students, most older than me, expressed genuine appreciation for the technology skills I helped them develop. There is profound satisfaction in watching an 80-year-old woman video chat with her grandchildren for the first time, or seeing the pride on a retired veteran's face when he successfully navigates online banking without pride. Assistance. My apartment, once sparse and utilitarian, has become a true reflection of myself. Books line the walls, comfortable furniture invites visitors to linger, and photographs both old and new document my journey. Margaret's presence remains, her picture still by my bedside, but it is no longer a shrine to what was lost, but rather an acknowledgement of the foundation upon which I have built this new life. Perhaps the most unexpected development has been my relationship with Barbara. What began as casual friendship deepened gradually into companionship and eventually into love. Not the passionate, all-consuming love of youth, but something equally powerful. A connection forged through shared understanding of loss and appreciation for life's fragility. Last spring, we decided to combine our households, moving into a slightly larger apartment that accommodates both our possessions and habits. We have not married, feeling no need for formal recognition of our partnership, but we have built a life together that brings joy to us both. I never expected to find this again, Barbara said recently, as we sat on our small balcony watching the sunset. After James died, I thought that part of my life was over. Margaret would have liked you, I told her, a statement that once would have been impossible to imagine making about another woman. She always said I needed someone to keep me from taking myself too seriously. Barbara laughed. She was right about that. My relationship with my grandchildren has flourished despite the geographic distance. Tyler, now 15, visits regularly during school breaks, staying in the guest room Barbara and I set up specifically for family visits. Amanda, 11, joins him when permitted, though Lisa still attempts to limit her contact with me. Technology bridges the gaps between visits. We video chat weekly, play online games together, and exchange emails about their interests and activities. I have become adept at navigating social media platforms, initially to maintain these connections, but eventually finding unexpected community there myself. Edward and I have established a cautious relationship, neither as close as before nor as broken as it once was. He visits occasionally, sometimes with the children, sometimes alone. Our conversations remain somewhat guarded, but the open hostility has faded. I have accepted that we may never fully recapture the relationship we once had, but what exists now is honest, if limited. Lisa remains the one unresolved element. The apology Edward promised never materialized. When we are forced to interact at family events, she maintains a cool civility that barely masks her continued resentment. I have made peace with this dynamic, recognizing that her opinion of me no longer holds power over my self-worth. The grief support group I joined during those early months has become an important part of my life, though my role has evolved from participant to occasional facilitator. Sharing my experience of multiple losses and subsequent rebuilding offers hope to newer members still struggling through the darkest days of their grief. Grief is not something you get over, I often tell them. It is something you learn to carry differently as time passes. Some days it is a boulder crushing your chest. Other days a small stone in your pocket that you touch occasionally to remember. This perspective extends beyond my grief for Margaret to encompass the complex emotions surrounding Edward's betrayal. I have learned that forgiveness does not require forgetting or excusing harmful actions. Rather, it means releasing the expectation that the past could have been different and choosing not to let bitterness dictate my future. The financial security I once took for granted is something I now appreciate deeply. Living on a fixed income has taught me to distinguish between needs and wants, to find satisfaction in experiences rather than possessions. The modest savings I am now able to set aside each month represents not just financial prudence but reclaimed independence. Most profoundly, I have discovered that age is not the barrier to reinvention that I once feared. At 69, I have created a new career, new relationships, and new purpose. The resilience developed through adversity has become my most valuable asset, allowing me to face uncertainty with confidence rather than fear. If Margaret could see me now, I believe she would be proud of the man I have become in her absence. Not because I have forgotten her or moved on from our life together, but because I have honored her memory by refusing to surrender to bitterness or despair. The love we shared for 42 years remains the foundation upon which I have built this unexpected new chapter. When Lisa shouted those cruel words across the dinner table 2 years ago, she intended them as a final rejection, a severing of family ties. Instead, they became the catalyst for a journey of self-discovery and renewal. By demanding I leave, she unknowingly set me free to become more fully myself than I had been in years. So, to anyone facing similar betrayal or loss, I offer this hard-won wisdom. Sometimes the people who should love you most fail you most profoundly. When that happens, you have a choice. You can allow their rejection to define you, or you can use it as the starting point for redefining yourself. The path forward may not be the one you planned, but it can still lead to a life of meaning, connection, and joy. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that ultimately led to unexpected growth? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this journey resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who might need to hear that even our darkest moments can lead to new beginnings. Thank you for listening to this chapter of my life. And remember, it is never too late to start again.